For 25 years, the leaders of the Soviet Union and the West had never once sat in the same room. In November 1943, they finally did, and for 4 days in a city called Tehran, the alliance actually worked. These were two sides that agreed on nothing: how a country should be run, who should own its wealth, what a human being is actually for, but they were held together by one thing: a common enemy in Hitler. Not friends, but allies out of necessity. By late 1943, the alliance was winning, and its three leaders finally agreed to meet face to face. Franklin Roosevelt of the United States, Winston Churchill of Britain, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union are often known as the Big Three. They met in Tehran, the capital of Iran, roughly halfway between the three leaders, and it was a place where Stalin, who hated flying, was willing to travel to. Roosevelt had decided the most important thing he could do was win Stalin's trust. He believed personal charm could achieve what formal diplomacy could not. At one point, he even teased Churchill in front of Stalin, deliberately, to show the Soviet leader that the two Western capitalists weren't a gang of two against him. Churchill, older and far more suspicious of communism, watched the Americans court Stalin and did not like what he saw. But in the room it worked. The three got on better than almost anyone had predicted. The question was whether the good mood could produce anything solid. So, what was agreed at Yalta? First, for 2 years, Stalin had demanded one thing above all else: a second front. An invasion of Western Europe that would force Hitler to fight in two directions at once and take the pressure off of the Red Army, which, remember, was doing almost all of the fighting and almost all of the dying. Roosevelt and Churchill committed to landing in France in the spring of 1944. The operation even had a name: Overlord. A real plan with a real date. Second, Stalin promised that once Germany was beaten, the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan. Third, all three agreed in principle to build a new organisation to keep the peace once the war was won. The idea would become the United Nations. On paper, this is the alliance at its very best. Promises made here were kept. Overlord became D-Day, and Stalin did, in time, declare war on Japan. So, if Tehran went so well, why do many historians treat this as the start of the trouble between the USSR and the USA? While the leaders shook hands over the Second Front, they had also been sketching the shape of post-war Europe. The plan was for Poland's borders to shift westwards. The Soviet Union would keep the land it had seized in 1939, and Poland would be compensated with German territory. The Poles themselves were not in the room. And underneath all these agreements sat one hard fact of geography. The Western armies would free Europe from the west coming up through France. The Red Army would free it from the east, driving through Poland, Romania and Hungary all the way to Germany. It was a great plan in theory. In practice, whoever soldiers were standing on the ground when the fighting stopped would decide what happened there next. Therefore, the Tehran Conference did not formally sign Eastern Europe over to Stalin, but it agreed to a strategy that would place the Red Army in every capital city between Moscow and Berlin. And an army, once it has arrived, is very hard to ask to leave. So, what interpretations exist around Tehran? One interpretation was it produced genuine cooperation. Three allies winning the war, agreeing on how to finish it. The warmth was real and the promises were kept. The other interpretation is that the Tehran Conference was the moment the West quietly conceded the East, not through betrayal but through a map, by agreeing to a plan that would leave Stalin's army in control of half of a continent. Tehran was the alliance working, and the alliance working is exactly what set up the problems during the Cold War. 14 months later, the Big Three met again. This time, it was on Soviet soil, at a resort called Yalta. But by then, the Red Army wasn't asking permission to enter Europe, it was already there.